every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The Gulf of Mexico, under the shroud of darkness, holds a quiet ancient power. For millennia, its depths have concealed vast reservoirs of prehistoric energy, trapped beneath miles of water, rock, and salt. But human ambition has long sought to breach that ancient vault. On the evening of April 20th, 2010, that ambition culminated in a violent, catastrophic reckoning. Aboard a state-of-the-art, ultra-deepwater, semi-submersible offshore drilling rig named the Deepwater Horizon, 126 crew members were going about their evening routines. They were floating 50 miles off the coast of Louisiana. Suspended above a well known as Macondo, it was meant to be a routine temporary abandonment procedure, sealing the well before moving the rig to its next assignment. Instead, at 9:49 in the evening, a geyser of drilling mud, methane gas, and water erupted onto the rig floor. Within minutes, the highly combustible gas found an ignition source. A series of explosions ripped through the vessel, instantly killing 11 men and transforming the massive steel structure into a towering inferno visible from satellites in space. This was not merely a tragic accident. It was the predictable climax of a cascading series of calculated risks, ignored warnings, and prioritized profits. Today, we dissect the anatomy of environmental manslaughter. We will explore the corporate negligence, the bypassed safety tests on the rig, and the subsequent criminal charges following the worst marine oil spill in United States history. It is a masterclass in the lethal cost of cutting corners. To understand how the Macondo well blew out, we must first understand the intense environment in which the Deepwater Horizon operated. The rig itself was owned and operated by Transocean, a massive offshore drilling contractor, but it was leased to BP, one of the world's largest oil and gas companies. BP was the operator of the Macondo prospect, meaning they called the shots, dictated the schedule, and ultimately bore the financial burden of the operation. And that financial burden was mounting. By April of 2010, the Macondo project was notoriously behind schedule. It was already 43 days over its projected timeline, and every single extra day the rig spent on location cost BP approximately $1 million in leasing fees alone. This immense financial hemorrhage created a pressure cooker environment. The directives coming from BP shoreside management were clear, if unspoken. Finish the well, secure it, and move the rig off location as quickly as possible. This urgency seeped into the daily operations and influenced the decision-making of the key personnel on board. On the rig, BP was represented by two well site leaders, often referred to as companymen. At the time of the disaster, these roles were filled by Donald Vadrine and Robert Kaluza. It was their responsibility to oversee the operations, ensure that BP's directives were followed, and ultimately approve the critical safety tests. However, they were reliant on a web of contractors, primarily Transocean for the drilling crew and Halliburton for the cementing operations. Cementing a deepwater well is perhaps the most critical safety measure in the entire drilling process. It is the barrier that keeps the immense, volatile pressures of the earth from surging up the wellbore. Halliburton was tasked with pumping a specialized cement slurry down the well to secure the production casing in place. The fatal chain of events began with this very cement job. The geological formation at the Macondo well was notoriously fragile, leading to a phenomenon known as lost circulation, where drilling fluids and cement escape into the surrounding rock rather than returning up the side of the casing. To combat this, BP and Halliburton decided to use a nitrogen-foamed cement. This type of cement is lighter and less likely to fracture the fragile rock. However, it is also notoriously difficult to mix and stabilize. In the weeks and days leading up to the final cement job, Halliburton conducted multiple laboratory tests on the specific slurry design intended for Macondo. Several of these tests failed miserably. The cement showed severe instability, meaning the nitrogen gas would break out of the mixture, rendering it incapable of providing a secure seal. Despite these failed tests, the information was not adequately communicated to the BP engineers, or if it was dangerously disregarded. Furthermore, to ensure the casing was centered in the wellbore, allowing the cement to flow evenly around it, devices called centralizers are used. BP engineers modeled the well and determined that 21 centralizers were required for a safe and effective cement job. However, only 6 centralizers were readily available on the rig. Flying more out would delay the operation by several days. A BP engineer shoreside ran an alternative model using only 6 centralizers, and the software warned of a severe risk of channeling, which means the cement would not form a complete ring, leaving gaps where gas could escape. In a now infamous email, a BP engineer dismissed the warning, essentially stating that it was done, end of story, and would probably be fine. They proceeded with only 6 centralizers. With a questionable cement slurry and inadequate centralization, the cementing operation was completed on April the 19th. The next critical step was the negative pressure test. This test is the ultimate fail-safe. It is designed to simulate the conditions of a temporarily abandoned well. By removing the heavy drilling mud from the wellbore and replacing it with lighter seawater, the crew intentionally underbalances the well. If the cement job at the bottom is secure, the pressure inside the drill pipe should read 0 because the cement is holding back the pressure of the earth. If the pressure rises, it means the cement has failed, and gas or fluids are leaking into the well. It is a stark binary test. It either passes or it fails. On the evening of April the 20th, the crew began the negative pressure test. Almost immediately, the readings were alarming. While the pressure on the kill line, one of the pipes leading down to the well, read 0, the pressure on the main drill pipe stubbornly remained at 1,400 pounds per square inch. This was a massive, glaring anomaly. It was a physical impossibility for a secure well to have 0 pressure on one line and 1,400 on another. The test had failed, yet the crew, overseen by BP company men Vedrine and Kaluza, spent hours trying to bleed off the pressure and retest, hoping for a different result. Each time the pressure returned. Faced with a failed test that would require them to halt operations, diagnose the cement failure, and potentially spend days and millions of dollars to remediate the well, the personnel on the rig engaged in a lethal form of confirmation bias. Someone, it is still disputed exactly who, proposed a theory known as the bladder effect. They hypothesized that the heavy mud in the wellbore was acting like a rubber bladder, trapping pressure against the blowout preventer and causing a false reading on the drill pipe. This theory had no basis in engineering reality. It was a fiction invented on the spot to explain away a terrifying anomaly. Because the kill line read 0, they chose to believe the kill line, completely ignoring the drill pipe reading. They declared the negative pressure test a success and proceeded to the next phase, which involved displacing the remaining heavy drilling mud with lighter seawater. By doing so, they were essentially removing the heavy lid from a boiling pot. The cement at the bottom of the well had indeed failed, compromised by the unstable nitrogen mixture and the lack of centralizers. Hydrocarbons, specifically highly pressurized methane gas, were already leaking into the wellbore, racing silently up the pipe toward the surface. Because the crew believed the well was secure, they were not actively monitoring the flow of fluids returning from the well with the hyper-vigilance required. As the gas rose, it expanded rapidly. By the time the mudlogger noticed an unexpected increase in the volume of fluids returning to the rig, it was too late. The well was completely out of control. At 9:40 in the evening, drilling mud suddenly began shooting out of the derrick, raining down on the rig floor. The crew scrambled to activate the blowout preventer, or BOP. The BOP is a massive, multi-ton stack of valves sitting on the ocean floor, designed to be the final line of defense. It contains powerful rams meant to shear through the drill pipe and crush it flat, sealing the well in an emergency. The crew hit the emergency disconnect sequence. The blind shear rams activated, but they failed to seal the pipe. Post-disaster investigations would reveal that the extreme pressure of the surging gas and mud had caused the drill pipe to buckle and bow off center inside the BOP. The shear rams, designed to cut a perfectly centered pipe, only partially severed it, leaving a gap for the roaring torrent of hydrocarbons to escape. The gas enveloped the rig floor, being sucked into the intake valves of the massive diesel engines that powered the Deepwater Horizon. The engines over-revved, screaming uncontrollably as they ran on the pure methane before violently exploding. The initial blast rocked the rig, plunging it into darkness and initiating a chaotic, terrifying evacuation. 115 men and women managed to escape the burning wreckage, many leaping into the oily, burning waters of the Gulf, before being rescued by a nearby supply vessel, the Damon Bankston. But 11 men, mostly those working on the drill floor and in the mudroom where the initial explosion occurred, were never seen again. For 2 days, the Deepwater Horizon burned, a towering inferno defying all attempts to extinguish it. On April the 22nd, the massive structure finally succumbed to the structural damage and sank beneath the waves, taking the tangled riser pipe down with it. But the disaster was only just beginning. With the rig gone and the blowout preventer compromised, the Macondo well was wide open, spewing raw crude oil and methane gas directly into the Gulf of Mexico at a staggering rate. Over the next 87 days, the world watched in horror as an estimated 210 million gallons of oil hemorrhaged into the ocean. The slick covered thousands of square miles, coating coastlines, suffocating marine life, and devastating the local fishing and tourism industries. The subsequent investigation into the disaster was unprecedented in its scope. The National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling concluded that the disaster was not the result of a single rogue mistake, but rather a systemic failure of risk management by BP, Transocean, and Halliburton. The Commission cited a culture of complacency, where financial pressures consistently overrode safety concerns. The bypassed cement tests, the agonizing decision to ignore the negative pressure test anomaly, the poorly maintained blowout preventer, all pointed toward a deeply ingrained corporate negligence. The anatomy of this disaster was built on a foundation of hundreds of small, dangerous decisions made in the pursuit of efficiency. The Department of Justice eventually filed criminal charges. In 2012, BP agreed to plead guilty to 14 criminal counts, including 11 counts of felony manslaughter, one for each man who died on the rig. They also pleaded guilty to environmental crimes and agreed to pay a record-setting $4 billion in criminal fines and penalties. Transocean also pleaded guilty to violating the Clean Water Act and paid $400 million in criminal fines. Halliburton pleaded guilty to destroying evidence related to their testing of the cement slurry and paid a relatively paltry maximum fine of $200,000. However, the pursuit of individual accountability proved to be a far more frustrating endeavor. The two BP well site leaders, Donald Vedrine and Robert Kaluza, were initially indicted on 11 counts of seamen's manslaughter, a specific federal statute designed to hold maritime operators accountable for deaths caused by negligence. Prosecutors argued that their decision to accept the flawed negative pressure test and their failure to monitor the well directly led to the blowout. The legal battle dragged on for years. The defense argued that the men were scapegoats, forced to rely on complex data and faulty equipment provided by contractors, and that they were operating within the chaotic, high-pressure environment cultivated by BP corporate. Ultimately, the federal government's case against the individuals crumbled. In 2015, the Justice Department dropped the manslaughter charges against both Vedrine and Kaluza. Vedrine eventually pleaded guilty to a single misdemeanor charge of violating the Clean Water Act and received probation. Kaluza refused to plea, took his case to trial, and was completely acquitted by a jury in less than 2 hours. Other executives and managers who had exerted the intense financial pressure that trickled down to the rig floor faced virtually no criminal consequences. The outcome left many victims' families and environmental advocates deeply disillusioned, concluding that while corporations can be fined out of their profits, the executives who drive the culture of negligence remain largely insulated from the walls of a prison cell. The Deepwater Horizon disaster permanently altered the landscape of the Gulf of Mexico and the global energy industry. The Macondo well was eventually intercepted by relief wells and permanently cemented, burying the source of the devastation deep beneath the sea floor. Yet, the ecological scars remain, a toxic legacy lingering in the deep-sea sediments and the marshlands of Louisiana. When we dissect the anatomy of this case, we do not find a malicious killer lurking in the shadows. Instead, we find something far more pervasive and mundane. We find an environment where the normalization of deviance became standard operating procedure. We find a boardroom culture where acceptable risk was defined not by human safety, but by profit margins and daily lease rates. The tragedy of the Macondo well demonstrates that when humanity attempts to conquer the formidable forces of nature with arrogance and compromised engineering, the earth will eventually and violently take back its domain. The ocean will slowly wash away the oil from the beaches, but it can never wash away the stain of 11 lives lost to the simple, brutal mathematics of corporate greed. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.